Welcome to the Election Tricycle, a weekly podcast that focuses on elections in the UK, US, India, and elsewhere. Every week, we try to get into some of the things that are happening in our respective regions, and occasionally we try and bring on a guest to give us a little additional insight. The show is brought to you by myself, Rohan, Venkat, currently in Philadelphia, Emily Tamkin in DC.
Hello.
And we usually have Tom Hamilton on with us, but Tom will be missing this episode. In his stead, we have a very special guest. We have Manisha Pande. Hi, Manisha.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. Manisha is the managing editor at News Laundry, a news publication in India, where she writes and hosts TV Nuisance, a weekly news and critique show that you could broadly compare to the Daily Show in its general style.
With like 1/10 of the resources.
The broad aim of the show is to sort of track and skewer the absurdity of TV news in India, which means Manisha and her team's job is often to actually pay attention and watch all of this stuff. I don't know how you guys manage to actually do this stuff on a daily basis, but we thought we'd have you on to give our listeners a better sense of the media's role in how things work in India. So for those who live outside India, we hear often about democratic backsliding and questions about how robust and free and fair are elections. But I think what people outside don't necessarily get a sense is, outside of what the politicians are doing, what exactly it's like for ordinary citizens in terms of what media they are seeing and listening to. So I want to just get a general sense for you. Where do you place the mainstream media in India at the moment?
Where do I start? Okay, so for the purpose of this conversation, I think we narrow our scope to mainstream television news. That is the most loudest medium. It's the most consumed medium, and it often sets the narrative. These are channels based out of New Delhi, which is the capital. So, and these are channels with great access and often kind of define, the discourse in the country. Now, I think, when we talk about elections in India, democracy in India, we talk about voting. And that's our general understanding, even in India, that, there are elections, there are free and fair elections. And India does a fairly great job of, having a relentless election cycle, whether it's at the center or the many states that we have. But I think a key component to democracy is institutions, and media is one of the major aspects of that. The ability for a voter to have credible information, to make electoral choices. I think media plays a huge role in that. And when you look at TV news in India, it's completely failing that goal to provide credible, reliable information to voters on the basis of which they can, assess what their leaders are doing and then go in and, place their vote. I think for an audience that's not familiar with the very noisy and chaotic TV news space, I think the example that I love to give is like you have Fox News. India only has variations of Fox News today as I speak. There is no left of center even. There's not even a center. It's mostly extreme right-wing, nutty right-wing, and then center right. And these channels are, I like to say they're like Fox on cocaine, because it's not about partisanship. You're talking hyper partisanship across primetime news, extreme vilification of the opposition. And in fact, maybe we can come to some of the data that we've collected on the kind of programming that we see on these channels.
May I ask, obviously there are many reasons that media in any given country is not not doing what it could, but I guess in India specifically, is it failing to do its job because of financial constraints? Is it because of state pressure? Is it because of the combination of financial constraints and state pressure? Like, why do you think it's at the situation where it is, where people are just not getting non-right-wing news from the television?
It's a complicated question, and I often wonder about it because there are no easy answers to really understand what's happening in the media, especially like television news. Like I said, we're talking about, say, 7 p.m. to 9 p.m. news, which is completely pro-government, and pro-government to the point where Modi's day fight, he's spoken about in terms of a world leader. You know, in fact, very comically, you have anchors saying that, you know, he's not just the Prime Minister of India, he's the Prime Minister of the whole world. And, you know, the world loves him. He can stop the war between Ukraine and Russia. So it's really, you know,
Yeah,
working
wow.
towards the cult of, you know, Modi. And anyone in the opposition is basically demonized. They are anti-nationals, they are anti-India, they are probably on the payrolls of Pakistan. They don't have the interests of the majority Hindu population at the heart of their politics. So that's what we're talking about now. Why does this happen? I think one big reason is that there is an ideological alignment with the Bharatiya Janata Party's project. If you look at the Indian newsroom, especially the top television news channels, most anchors are upper caste Hindu males. So there's very little diversity. Think of it like a completely, you know, white newsroom with like zero diversity, uh, and really upper caste elite. And I think they've always sort of been sympathetic to this project. And I think there's a need, kind of an ideological alignment now with some of the projects of Hindutva or of Hindu supremacy or of painting Muslims as the villain. So there's that. Secondly, there's every media owner in India has other business interests. So that could be education, they could own universities, they could be in mining, they could be in infrastructure. So media is just one of the businesses. In fact, two of the largest business houses in India own television news channels. So Ambani and Adani both have television news. One of them has a network and the other one has a channel now. So when you have to do business in India, you can't, you know, owning a news outlet is basically influence peddling with the government of the day. So you can't really go against the government of the day or question them in a way that could harm your other business interests. So there's a business alignment. And I think thirdly, just the model of news, which is extremely dependent on government advertising in India. It used to be a good mix of corporate and government advertising, but I think over the last 5 years, we've seen, especially with Corona, sort of a slowdown. We see a heavy dependence on advertising from the government. And the BJP has maximum number of governments in the states and it's at the power and center. So if you want your business to flourish, you need, you know, you need to be in the good books. And government uses ads as a carrot and stick approach. So the more pliant you are, the more likely you are to get ads. And one negative story can make you lose your advertising money for, you know. The other thing is also, I think that you have a situation in India where the Prime Minister hasn't given a press conference over the last 10 years. This is a government that believes in one-way communication. They believe in having their own, basically they believe in bypassing journalists. And it comes with a certain, I think, contempt or disdain for journalism, for the very idea of being questioned or be, you know, held accountable for something. And in such a situation, I think access becomes extremely important for journalists to stay relevant. And I think a lot of anchors, especially the loud, you know, noisy ones, in an election season, those are the guys who get the interviews with the prime minister.
Some of the conditions that you mentioned here, like the way the Indian media works, the way it's structured, the influence of big business, has not necessarily changed between this past 10-year period and the period
Yeah.
before. And the other thing I just want to flag for listeners is that when people who haven't seen Indian media think about government mouthpieces, essentially, they think of very boring, straightforward attempts to just republish whatever the government is saying. And I think what I'd like to impress upon them, and maybe like you can do it well because you have to pay attention to these folks all the time, is how almost competitive they are in proving themselves. This is a free market tacked on to some odd level of pro-government propaganda.
Yeah, I think there's often, like we joke that they do. I think even the BJP spokespersons are sometimes stunned at what the anchors are saying, because I think even they can't fathom this kind of stuff that can, you know, sometimes be said. So, yeah, it's not just boring Doordarshan, you know, the state public TV that we have, that kind of propaganda. It's really, like I said, I mean, if uh, there's the whole thing of, Modi calling Putin and stopping the war. Russia-Ukraine war, to get Indian students out. Now, this was denied by the Ministry of External Affairs. This did not happen. But you had hours and hours of programming talking about how Modi is great. His phone call with Putin fixed this, and the world is listening to him. Joe Biden is calling him for advice. It's really, really, at one level, it's fantastical. I mean, the kind of things that can be spun around Modi. But if you look at, the result of it, you have, if you, just we are in the middle of an election cycle, if you actually go out and speak to people who are consuming this, one of the big reasons why people vote for Modi is because they feel he stopped the war. They actually feel that India is powerful enough today under Modi to stop wars, that no one paid heed to us 10 years ago. And today we have a prime minister who can show the world, where we are and what we can do. That's a huge part of why a lot of people say that they want to vote for Modi. Even if there's unemployment or their own circumstances may not be well off, they say that at least the country is going in a direction which is great under this leader. And when it comes to vilification of opposition, now I don't think there's been many pieces written on how weak the opposition is. In fact, you've had pieces talking about why one of the reasons why Modi is where he is because the opposition hasn't been able to get its act together. So I understand criticizing the opposition, but these anchors would go to the extent of, calling them anti-national, or that they're being paid by Pakistan, or sometimes even just, you have like anchors straight up calling them stupid, like there are shows that call Rahul Gandhi an idiot or stupid, or, with hashtags like Rahul is strange. I mean, that's what we're talking about. So.
Yeah, the political scientist Asim Ali. We last week we in our recommendations column I mentioned one of the things that came out of News Laundry, an analysis that you guys did on what shows up in the evening shows, and how much of it is opposition bashing and how little of it is on substantive issues. And the political scientist Asim Ali has made the argument that the reason why some folks are so surprised at how harsh Modi's tone has been in the last few weeks regarding Muslims and so on is because he's broadly outsourced the job of doing the dog whistling to the media, and only now has to jump in the fray during elections.
Absolutely. I mean, through times like Corona, to give you an example, after 2019, where we were struggling with a very sudden lockdown, you had images of migrants walking back home to their villages. You had, reports after report about, shortage of oxygen. Real time of uncertainty. You had a lot of anchors dedicate a sizable amount of time on Muslims and how they have brought Corona to India. You've had, and this whole, in fact, I think in the run up to elections, it's been a little less, the anti Muslim dog whistling on television news. But if you look at, I can't remember over the past 2 years a single day where I haven't seen a news anchor talk about some or the other form of jihad that Muslims are inflicting on Hindus. This is love jihad, where apparently, Muslim men are out to lure majority Hindu women and convert them. Land jihad, that they're up to grab your land. Jobs jihad, that they're out to take your, jobs. Spit jihad, this odious, this is happening on television news, by the way, where anchors comes and tell you that, this was a show that a Hindi news channel had done, which said that Muslims are spitting into your food, it's called spit jihad. So, everything from, who they love to how they pray to what they eat to the jobs that they aspire to is under suspicion. And it's really, really odious. And it's relentless. Every day there's something or the other which is anti-Muslim. I think, in fact, in the run-up to elections, it's become less. But last 2 years, I don't remember a single day actually without, running into some or the other anti-Muslim propaganda on television news channels. And you have BJP spokespersons on that who would side with the, so even if it's not Mr. Modi saying things, it's the BJP spokesperson will pretty much come on board and,
Are there any, are there any stories that are simply not covered, right? Where it's the flip side. Instead of relentless coverage, it gets no coverage at all. So for, people talk about how, how Russians have this very one-sided view of the war in Ukraine because they're only watching TV, and so they only hear that Ukraine's full of Nazis and Russia needed to invade. Or even like Israel today, one of the points that people make is that Israelis are actually seeing less of what's happening in Gaza on TV than those of us here in the United States, or or in many other parts of the world. Are there major stories that you feel are just not getting through on TV news? Or is it more that everything is covered, but it's in this slanted right
I think,
wing way?
like the research that we had done in the run up to elections showed that less than 1% of the debates are on in unemployment or education. So, see, I tell you one thing, there's a difference that if there's a big news event, it'll get covered. Say there's a big protest of young people who are, against a certain government policy, it'll get covered as a news bulletin. But then, through the prime time, it'll probably be demonized. And the other thing that we don't really have a lot, what we're failing to do in mainstream media is that we're not providing people with the tools to assess the government. So if there's a policy issue,
right,
an anchor will not come and explain to you why it's the government of India's responsibility, right? So we're unable to kind of draw those connections between what's not working in our life or what are the issues that we're facing, connected to who's responsible in the government. So I think that kind of, to the point that now Modi is quite, he's quite above politics in that sense. When you look at elections, he's quite above what the issues in the country really are. If unemployment is an issue, it's a huge issue, you'd rarely have a voter say that, yeah, Modi is responsible. It's just, we don't have enough questioning. So I think that is one thing. Mm-hmm. There isn't a complete blackout, I'd say. That news still makes its way to bulletins, but it's how it's framed. So often a protest, like I said, will be covered, but then it may not be covered in the prime time. Or if it does get covered in the prime time, you'll have anchors vilifying protesters, saying that they're no-gooders, or they're against Indian interests and stuff like that.
Sure.
And a lot of this has real life consequences, right? Like it's not just these people sitting in their studios talking. We've seen anchors even demonize fellow journalists. We've seen people people being under threat physically, or situations erupting in parts of the country because of some of this rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, there's one more peculiar thing about Indian television news right now is that anchors are at the forefront of demanding a clampdown on press freedom. So when the BBC got quote unquote surveyed but raided for all practical purposes, you had primetime anchors saying, great, the BBC has no business coming to India and talking about our prime minister.
Just give us the background. The BBC was raided by the tax authorities after it broadcast a documentary about Modi's tenure in Gujarat, where he was chief minister when riots broke out, and he's been accused of being complicit, or at least of having turned his eyes away from it and let it happen. Sorry, go ahead, Manisha.
Yeah, and so that night when the surveys took place, anchors were cheering. It's great. We need to put them in jail. We need to teach them a lesson. So a large section of mainstream media is at the forefront of demanding a clampdown on journalistic freedoms, which is just a very, very scary place to be in. We had one incident. I'll tell you the real life consequences, especially with the anti-Muslim stuff that we see on TV. Just last year, you had a hate crime where one railway police officer went on a shooting spree in a train, and from reports that came out, it appeared that he targeted Muslims. That he went from one coach to the other looking for Muslim passengers to kill. And he was really talking. He was saying things that you usually hear on TV. That these people, their allegiance is to Pakistan. This is something that you hear routinely on Indian television news. That the Muslims in our country, their patriotism is under suspicion. Their allegiances are under suspicion. They're as a monolith, they are to be doubted. And you saw this hate crime, occur just last year, and I think it was pretty stark because the things that he was saying is, I was like, okay, I hear this all the time on television news. Now, there could be many other reasons for why he did what he did. But even when it comes to just day-to-day conversations, I think, we've always had prejudices between communities in India. It's a very diverse country, and when such diverse people come to live together, it wasn't always hunky dory. It's not like we all loved each other and lived, really happily. We always had prejudices, Hindus and Muslims. They always took form of ugly riots or a certain kind of politics. But I think how commonplace it's become now to air those prejudices and be celebrated for airing those prejudices. That's something new. You're almost uh, applauded if you can come up with something nasty about Muslims, or there's no sort of, no one's going to think twice before saying anything about Muslims. So I think the public discourse in general has just really gone down because of television news. It's okay to say these things now out loud.
What's it like for you personally, and for you folks at News Laundry, and covering this all the time, calling it out all the time, satirizing some of this? Yeah, what has that been like for you, both in terms of having to actually just sit through all of this hate, but then also be on the receiving end, I'm sure, of comments and worse.
So, I mean, News Laundry has been critiquing, the media for a very long time, and unlike in the West, where there's a healthy tradition of the media critiquing or reporting on itself, you don't really have that in India. So we were one of the first to kind of really say that, okay, if we can question politicians, bureaucrats, actors, sports people, we also deserve to be put under scrutiny. So this has been part of what we've been doing for a long time. But I think somewhere around 2016, we saw this turn in television news, which was really jarring, that it was no longer about partisanship or praising the government in power or acting as a PR agent of the government. News really became anti-people, where you had anchors demanding jailing of students who may be anti-Modi, and anchors demanding, often you'd have police action on a particular activist, and it would be preceded by this prime time frenzy about this activist and how dangerous they are. So we saw like real anti people consequences to what was happening, and we thought the best way to respond to this is in their own language, and we didn't want to take that preachy route. I think satire can really communicate a lot to people and can really reach out to more people. So it's really hard for my research team because some of them are young and some of them are Muslims also. So I think it's even harder to watch some of the stuff that goes on. But we do it because I think the response has been amazing. I think a lot of people in India recognize, even if they're supporters of the BJP, that the news is not serving them anymore. That even if we support the BJP, we need certain things to be asked of our government. So I think there's that healthy sort of tradition that I hope we're not going to forget too soon. I see a lot of, in this election, I see a lot of these anchors who are like Modi government megaphones losing relevance in terms of, if you just look at the views or the sort of comments they're getting, online at least, there's a big pushback, especially among young people, who are really now pushing back against media that's not talking about their issues. Look, we don't have a job. We're, having issues with our examinations, and you're talking about Pakistan, and you're talking about how we're Vishwaguru, we're like the leaders of the world. So I think there's a huge pushback, and it's satisfying and rewarding to know that, okay, our critique is reaching out, and people are kind of, irrespective of whatever side of the political divide you're on, people are able to recognize the importance of a media that questions someone who's in power. I think so. That keeps us going.
Yeah, maybe the one additional question on that is that a lot of your work shows up on platforms,
Yeah.
YouTube being the obvious one, and so and that's also been the site of a lot more critique of the
Yeah.
government because TV is so captured. We're seeing more. There's a YouTuber named Dhruv Rathi who's gotten particularly popular over the last few months, but there's been others, and at a more local level, that's often the platform. But then the question maybe is what happens to the platform? Is that something that have something that worries you?
Yeah, I think especially because I honestly agree with you that in this election, the maximum amount of kind of pushback, dissent, or questioning of the government has come from YouTube. It is really remarkable to see how so many people are tuning into other alternatives, dumping television news. So I think that there is going to be some sort of, I'm anticipating some sort of curtailing of freedom or some stricter laws around what you're going to put out on YouTube or on any of the digital platforms. Because I feel like this is a medium where the government is having a hard time controlling it, So I expect things to get a little tougher for us in the next few years if the BJP comes back to power, which I think it will.
So we end our regular segment with a segment called Tricycle Recommends. Is there a piece of yours or a link or anything that you would want to share with our listeners that you think sort of gives a taste of what you do?
Yeah, just for your audience, I think those who want to familiarize themselves with the loud and chaotic world of television news, I'm going to recommend two shows that we have done. They have English subtitles. One is about Modi's visit to the United States of America. It's really interesting. You should see some of the stuff that the anchors were saying about him. And also about the United States of America. So
yeah.
I think it'll be really interesting for you guys to watch that. One anchor actually went around your supermarkets looking at the prices of vegetables and saying that, look how expensive vegetables are here, and Indians keep complaining about inflation, and we are so much better than them. So you have to watch that to just understand where we are. And the second episode is on the BBC raids surveys when that happened, how the media reacted to it, because I think that gives you a good understanding of how anti-democratic the sentiment is on television news. I read a really great profile in New York Times on Rahul Gandhi that I think would be interesting for everyone to read. And The Economist's piece on Man Ki Baat, I think is very interesting, especially when you look at the
Man Ki Baat is Modi's radio show. He does it fortnightly, and he's used it as a way of, again, reaching out directly, like sort of fireside chat type thing, but he's using it as a way to go around the media and go directly to the listener.
Exactly. So there's no press conferences. There's Man Ki Baat, which literally means my heart's conversation. I guess is that how you translate?
Heartfelt thoughts.
Heartfelt conversation. So it's very interesting. It's a good analysis on that. And I actually watched Civil War, which I really enjoyed. So if you guys haven't caught that, you should watch it. Nice film.
Okay. Well, having now passed the responsibility for recommending something, which is our job, onto you, I think we can leave it there, Rohan.
Yeah, we can do. I mean, we can do our recommendations as well, Emily. If
all right,
if you
fine,
want to do
okay.
that quickly.
So here's what I was going to recommend. It's totally not related to anything that we just talked about, except for the descent of democracy. It is related to something we're going to talk about in the premium section. So a little tease for you. The piece is called "The One Thing Trump Knows He Wants in a Running Mate." It's by Jamel Bowie at the New York Times. I know what you're thinking. Like, finally, the New York Times gets a boost on our podcast. It's so nice to have a little-known journalism outlet just finally take off. No, we will put the link to that in the show notes. And Rohan, what's yours?
Yeah, I'm going to flag a piece by Rokibo Zaman at Scroll. This came out yesterday. It's an interesting piece titled "No Muslim Can Win Now or in the Future in Assam's Barpeta. Delimitation Fears Confirmed." Gerrymandering is not very old, or there's been a lot of gerrymandering in India, but not in quite the ways that has happened in the US. But we've seen it being used much more actively in the last 10 years and much more deliberately. And this piece covers one element of that specifically, to keep out religious demography rather than partisan. I mean, although those things are connected in India. So yeah, that's where we're at. Thank you so much, Manisha, for joining us on the Election Tricycle.
Thank you for having me.
We'll put links to all the work that we've mentioned and to Manisha's work in general on our show notes. And for those of you who have a premium membership, do stick around. For those who don't, do sign up at hubwave.tricycle.net or at emilyctamkin.substack.com. And thank you for listening to the Election Tricycle.